Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this IFG webinar on after Sue Gray, what next for Downing Street? My name is Tim Durrant. I'm a Programme Director here at the IFG. Over the weekend, on Sunday afternoon, IFG phones were buzzing as the news spread that Sue Gray had stepped down. Obviously, we were interested in Sue's exit and her replacement by Morgan McSweeney, but it also goes to themes that the IFG has talked about over many years about the structures at the centre of government, how roles and responsibilities are divided, and how the system is not good at delivering. We have said over many years that the centre of government simply does not work, whoever is in power and whoever is doing the top jobs. So today we're going to talk about what Keir Starmer is trying to do with his reset, what went wrong for Sue Gray, how the new people in post might do things differently, but also what are the kind of bigger structural questions that the new government needs to deal with to make No.10 and the rest of the centre of government fit for purpose in the 2020s and beyond. We've got a brilliant panel here to discuss this. My colleague Alex Thomas, who used to be a senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office. He leads the IFG Civil Service Work Programme and was part of the team looking at how the centre of government works that we published on earlier in the year. My other colleague, Kath Haddon, top IFG colleague and a veteran Westminster and Whitehall watcher. Try and say that quickly. And Sam Friedman, IFG Senior Fellow and former government advisor as well, and author of the recent book, Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How to Fix It, which is, of course, required reading here at IFG Towers. So we've got a lot to talk about over the next hour or so. There's some questions coming through on Slido already. Thank you for those. Please do keep sending them in. I'll try and draw them in throughout the conversation. Just use the Slido on the website where you're watching this from. Kath, to kick off, were you surprised by the new news of Sue Gray's exit, or do you think this was inevitable?
Yes, good question. I think on the day, no, well, yes, a lot of us were surprised, as you say, the phones were buzzing. There hadn't been any sort of immediate rumours that something is about to happen. So the announcement, when it finally came, was a bit of a surprise. I think both the timing and the manner of it. I'll come back to the manner of it. But I don't think there was huge surprise amongst sort of Whitehall watchers, Westminster bubble, that it had happened. In as much as obviously the media stories had become very prevalent, it was obviously becoming very destabilizing. We talked in a recent podcast about the inevitable No.10 reset that seemed to be coming down the track, and anyone who was at Labour Party conference was probably privy to lots of rumours about what might happen, what the solution might be, what Starmer might want to do about the obvious personnel problem, the infighting in the heart of his No.10. And I think as Sue Gray's own statement on Sunday said, when you have become the story, it is A, very difficult to do your job, and B, it is hard to find a solution to it that doesn't involve an inevitable exit. But I do think the swiftness of it when it finally came and the way in which it was resolved probably did surprise, because it could have been something that was mishandled, that just made the problems worse, either through showing weakness or through the way in which the story was played out. But I mean, we'll come on to talking about what they have done in the immediate aftermath and whether or not that holds for success long term. But the immediate reaction to it was generally seeing it as a sort of sensible solution once you have decided that Sue Gray was the person to depart. I think the other reason, though, that, whether it's surprising or not, but is certainly remarkable, is to have a reset so early in an administration. We had a chart out showing that actually a lot of chief of staff in recent years haven't lasted that long. So there have been quite a few times when prime ministers have found that a particular person in that job was not the right mix for it. But even so, for a new government coming in with such a large majority, having spent a lot of time in opposition in theory, thinking through how it wanted to govern, it is, it basically saying that there was a massive problem here, and it is really an acknowledgement of the problems that they've had in the transition in their first few months in office that, yes, concern the personnel, but I think go a lot wider than that. So that acknowledgement of the problem was also something that will long be remarked upon, I think.
And we're going to get onto that point about those wider problems and indeed, as you say, the kind of things that came in with transition. But Just before we do, Alex, Kath mentioned there that the government moved quickly to sort of fill the gaps. Do you want to just talk us through kind of what's changed, who's in, as well as who's out?
Yeah, so 5 new appointees, some familiar faces, some people more new to it. So yeah, five people, famous five. So to run through them very briefly without giving kind of full biographies, the most notable, most important appointment is of Morgan McSweeney to replace Sue Gray as Chief of Staff. He's been on the scene for a long time, been in charge of Labour's campaign, the election campaign, also the strategy for, from Labour's point of view, winning the next election. And there were all of these reports, as I'm sure everybody watching will be aware, of tensions inside Number 10 between, if not the two principal characters themselves, at least kind of people in the McSweeney camp and in the Gray camp. So McSweeney has won the power battle, such as it was there, and his chief of staff. He's got 2 new deputy chiefs of staff, Jill Cuthbertson, who's been around the Labour Party for a long time, worked for Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband, and others, very experienced, and she's the Director of Government Relations. So you might expect her, we don't know for sure, but you might expect her to take a more sort of government Whitehall-y facing role as Deputy Chief of Staff. And then Vidya Alexan, who is the Political Director in Number 10 and has been Director of External Relations. So she may end up taking on some more of the sort of political stuff. But critical to the success of that trio will be the synthesis, the fusing of the civil service administrative side and the political side to kind of get on with everybody in Number 10, but be that kind of powerhouse at the centre to bring together the government work and the political and strategic objectives of Labour in government. Nin Pandit is the next new person, though she was in Downing Street before. She's the new principal private secretary to the Prime Minister. Really important job, heading up the civil service team and all the private secretaries in Number 10, and presumably working directly to the Cabinet Secretary, new Cabinet Secretary, when they're appointed. She's worked inside government, outside government. She's worked in the NHS, digital background, but also worked in the charity sector. Clearly a very qualified person, but interestingly not from the Treasury or some of the sort of classic homes of principal private secretaries past. So we may get onto this. There's a lingering question about how Number 10 is doing economic and fiscal policy. And the final new person, James Lyons, has been a lobby journalist. Is the new strategic director of communications. I assume they will be hoping will plug some of that gap that we saw around Giftgate and scandals, and doing a bit more of the kind of filling the grid, filling the narrative in a way that there's been quite a lot of criticism recently.
Well, thank you for that rundown, and as you say, lots to talk about there. But before we get into a bit more detail about those changes and indeed future changes, I just want to go to Sam. So A, Sam, what was your kind of reaction when you heard the news? And B, we've seen that you were asked on Twitter about whether these big roles are fundamentally unmanageable. Do you think anyone can make a success of this kind of job?
Thanks very much. This is essentially kind of chapter 1 of my books. Very nice of the government to put on this sort of display in order to help me sell copies. And no, I mean, I think I like Kath said, I don't think anyone was really surprised that she went, and there's been this reorganization. I mean, the timing is probably a bit sooner than people might have expected, but no, clearly things weren't working very well, and that had been clear for a long time. But I think this sort of structural question is the really interesting one. Is like, can you actually make Downing Street work in its current form? And I think the story, which I'll do very, very quickly, is that of a role of Prime Minister that's changed very dramatically over 40-50 years, from being a kind of chairman of the board type role to being a fairly presidential role in which the Prime Minister is expected to be involved in and visibly lead on everything that happens in government. And yet the resources that he or she has available to do that haven't really changed very much since the 1970s. We've seen, in that period, Harold Wilson introduced the policy unit, which is stuck. Blair introduced a delivery unit, which is kind of stuck, sort of, in slightly different forms. The press team has got bigger. The political team has got a bit bigger. But generally speaking, you're still trying to do this very different role in with a team that is far too small and can't possibly firefight and manage everything that's going on all over Whitehall, and you're still doing it from a small house. And whilst the building isn't the most important thing, it is mad trying to do this, trying to run the centre of government with your chief advisors like stuffed into closets and waiting rooms. So I think it's incredibly. I think this is a really good opportunity if they want to take it to reconsider whether this is a workable model at all, and see what they've done, the changes they've made this time right now as a kind of fix to an immediate problem, but have a wider think about ideas that have been around for a long time and are in the report that the Institute did on the centre of government around building a much stronger centre that's able to support a Prime Minister properly, able to give them proper negotiating power with the Treasury, which they've kind of lost over the last few years, to great detriment. And then there's this broader question of taking powers out of the centre and devolution, which is, I think, essential to make all of government work. But I'm sure we can come on to some of those questions later.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to come to Alex to hear more about our thoughts on the centre. But before I do, just to keep on the subject of Chief of Staff for a moment, Kath, what's your sense of what went wrong in this setup, and who has done the job well in the past?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, first, in terms of the past, I think one of the telling things is the people that have lasted the longest in the role, and therefore you assume that's a mark of doing the job well, are the people that were lowest profile in a sense on it. I mean, obviously, Jonathan Powell, everyone knows the name, but he wasn't, a very in-your-face figure in terms of media stories, sort of running it. There were other characters in Blair's No.10 who were far more prominent and featured far more heavily in terms of stories breaking out. Similarly, Ed Llewellyn for David Cameron lasted throughout Cameron's premiership, much more behind the scenes. And even during the tumult of the Theresa May years after the election, and Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill left after the 2017 election, bringing in Gavin Barwell, again, lasted a long time considering the turmoil of that particular period of government. Since then, you've seen much higher turnover, obviously of prime ministers, but also of their chiefs of staff within it, as an excellent chart the IFG has got out there on all your social media platforms illustrates. So I think that is, part and parcel of it is don't become the story. And as Gavin Barwell used to put it, the key point here is that you are staffing the chief. You are a staffer. You are not. It's not supposed to be about you, and that might be a mark of it. I think, though, it is important at this moment that No.10 and Starmer in particular could make some mistakes if they don't learn the lessons from this episode, because we've seen in the last 2 days, basically a war of words about what went wrong and whose fault it was. First in the aftermath, and on Monday, lots of briefing coming from No.10 and probably some of the victors about all the things that were Sue Gray's apparent fault. And then today, a bit of a pushback from allies close to Gray about all of that. And I think it's a huge mistake, as quite a few people have pointed out today, for the government to just A, blame everything on Gray, and B, not reflect on that. And there's 2 particular points there. One is there may be aspects of how she was doing the role that Morgan McSweeney, taking on the Chief of Staff role, needs to reflect on. Accusations of bottleneck, the way in which you delegate to others. It is a huge job. You can't be across everything. You need to get experts in. And you need to make sure that ultimately you are servicing the Prime Minister and the whole of government's engagement with him. But I think they also need to reflect on what other problems have they found in these first few months in government that had absolutely nothing to do with Gray. Or maybe tangentially were, but, can't all be put at her doorstep. They need to sort of not just assume that the personnel has changed and therefore you've solved the problem. They need to actually reflect on what is and isn't working and create a bit more of an atmosphere for sort of challenge and learning, because they're still going through a transition into government. We're not 100 days into it. It is a new government sort of learning how they operate. And finally, Starmer needs to be part of that process. Obviously he was fundamental in making the final decision to make this change, but we've said this before with previous prime ministers. It is his No.10. They are his team. They are working to his, style of leadership. Ultimately, number 10 is led by the Prime Minister, not by the Chief of Staff. So he needs to be part and parcel of that reflection on what is working, what isn't working, and what further changes do they need to make to how they're operating, as well as the personnel involved.
Absolutely. And so that leads us on nicely to some of the themes we've started talking about. But Alex, I thought you could talk more now about the work that you and colleagues have done about how the centre of government works, just to pick up a couple of questions from the audience. So the most liked one is from someone anonymous who says, Morgan McSweeney wants to make radical changes to number 10. What would you suggest those changes should be? And then someone else anonymous has said, do you think the Cabinet Office is set up to effectively and efficiently communicate and deliver change, or is it in need of modernisation? So perhaps you can talk about sort of all of the changes in the centre that you and your team have looked into.
Two questions from civil servants there. Excellent anonymous questions. I mean, I'll talk about that in a second, just very briefly. I mean, to some of Kath's points, I mean, she mentioned Jonathan Powell. Interestingly, he's been in the news recently negotiating or helping negotiate the deal over the Chagos Islands. So I wonder if in a decade's time we'll see Sue Gray bringing peace to Gibraltar or something. So there we go. Anyway, we shall see. Looking at the other thing I was going to say on Sue Gray is precisely to Kath's point. It is just worth bearing in mind that there is every incentive for people still in government now to blame the ills of the world on Sue Gray, and clearly things did go wrong. But it's just worth having that, I think, in mind as you look at how this kind of plays out in all sides over the course of the next couple of days. Yeah, on the centre of government, and I'll sort of riff a bit off what Sam was saying in his excellent book available in all good bookshops. And we ran this commission on centre of government over the course of most of last year and early this, sort of in anticipation of precisely these problems. Even before the Starmer period in government, we were thinking, why is it that successive prime ministers find it so hard to get a grip on the machine and to lead and set direction from the centre? So we ran a commission, including the other half of the Friedman Substack, Lawrence Friedman, various other people, and concluded. I mean, I won't labour the sort of point about it being broken and the critique that Sam made, but to the number 10 point, underpowered. The way we framed it, to what Sam was saying around the kind of Prime Minister being presidential, I didn't think of it quite like that, but more that the Prime Minister is the executive leader of government. There's almost this sort of constitutional fiction, first among equals, chairing the cabinet, that is sort of, it's important for constitutional reasons, but actually in practice, the Prime Minister is an executive leader of government. And quite a lot of the problems come from us not treating the Prime Minister like that executive leader. So not for a moment do I think you should duplicate all the functions of departments in number 10 or a department of the Prime Minister. But you do need certain critical functions that allows the Prime Minister to go toe-to-toe with the Chancellor in terms of setting budgets and on economic strategy, so boosting the economic side of number 10, that allows the Prime Minister to get the information in to inform good decision making. Again, not hoovering up every bit of information from across the whole of government, but having a unit that can actually look at delivery and understand how government is performing in order to set that direction, because in our system it comes from the centre. On some of the kind of overnight stories about McSweeney and his kind of being a breaker and a shaker or whatever the phrase was, I mean, yes, I think a lot of us would agree that number 10 and the centre do need radical surgery, but you also need to learn from the Cummings episode that if you just go in with a tear it up attitude and you don't bring the system with you, you will be unsuccessful, because that is not the way to reform a system, and B, you are likely to make mistakes in what you do, both sort of presentationally and internally in terms of getting the right structures. So yes, be radical, but do it in quite a kind of targeted way, and a way that uses those people who recognise the problems with the system to help you get change. Very briefly on the Cabinet Office, to the second question. I mean, I worked in the Cabinet Office for years. I love the Cabinet Office. I feel I feel a pain in the state of the Cabinet Office, but it's not working at the moment. It's grown in size an awful lot. Okay, to some extent for technical reasons, fast streamers coming on the books and other bits of the government machinery kind of going on the Cabinet Office books, but it has really grown in size. It's lost its focus on its core responsibility, supporting the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to broker and reach more than lowest common denominator solutions by getting to decisions in the in the centre, and it's lost a lot of its authority. So whether you go kind of full fat reform, like we recommended in the Centre Commission, of creating a department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, amalgamating them and hiving off the functions, the corporate functions, to somewhere else, the very least you need to do, I think, is dramatically slim down the Cabinet Office and focus it on its core purpose.
Well, thank you. And as well as Sam's book, all of that stuff is available on our website. So do check that out too. Sam, I mean, do you get a sense that this is something that people in government are thinking about? This is something the Labour Party are interested in? Who has been interested in your book and other sort of prescriptions of how things could be done better?
I think there's an awareness of these challenges. Certainly, there have been ministers who've read the book. Some of them seem to have enjoyed it, perhaps less so now. I don't get the impression that so there was radical stuff that was associated with McSweeney is actually not very radical. I mean, it was all sort of pay your spads properly, get a few more of them in, and have use a bit of data in Downing Street. Actually, Sunak's Downing Street built a really good data dashboard. He just used it to make really bad decisions, but can't do anything about that. There's in that sense is not what he's being associated with, right or wrong, is not particularly radical at all. I actually think it might come from the officials as much as anything else. I mean, your question on the Cabinet Office, I don't know anybody in the Cabinet Office who thinks it's working, or anybody who previously worked in the Cabinet Office who thinks it's working. You know, you're going to have a new Cabinet Secretary coming in, presumably with the mandate to shake things up a bit and to do things a bit differently. The candidates that are in the reckoning, certainly the internal ones, are all ones who would be keen to make their mark and to shake things up a bit and know things aren't working as they have been over the last couple of years. So I think it might actually come not from McSweeney so much, although who knows, but more from who that choice of Cabinet Secretary, which is going to be really critical, and the mandate they're given to change some of these systems and structures, because it can't really come from the political side. It has to come with their support, but as much from the official side.
And it'll be interesting to see if officials have the bandwidth to make those changes now that there's a stable majority government, even if they're going through some challenging times themselves. So you mentioned the Cabinet Secretary. Obviously, Simon Case confirmed recently that he would be stepping down at the end of the year. Sort of one of the worst kept secrets in Westminster, and the job ad is now live for that. Kath, there's a question from Peter Horston, friend of the IFG. What are the consequences of Sue Gray's resignation for the recruitment of the new Cabinet Secretary? Will her resignation discourage applicants, or how will it affect it?
Undoubtedly will affect it. It's much more with it. It's obviously she's going to be less of an influence on that process. Ultimately, it is Starmer's decision to make. He's being advised by a panel of former Cabinet Secretary, former Permanent Secretaries and Civil Service Commission. It is not ultimately the decision of the Chief of Staff, but it is now Morgan McSweeney who has a greater influence than Sue Gray. So if there were any candidates who Sue Gray particularly favoured, that might not be so much in their favour now. I'm not going to go through the runners and riders and what that might mean for all of them. But I think it does create a more open field, because ultimately we don't know what kind of Cabinet Secretary would work best with Keir Starmer. He's only worked with one. He may have seen others from further afield in the past, and he now has more experience of government and of being Prime Minister, that I hope he's getting that advice from that panel, from others, about what kind of Cabinet Secretary he should want. He certainly can read Alex Thomas's excellent blogs, which set out some of the criteria that he should be looking for. So I think it probably improves the process. It makes it more of an open field. I would hope that it encourages more people. I would hope it doesn't discourage anyone from applying, because I think the more robust a field there is, the better the ultimate candidate is. But I think also the fact that you've had this reset, for all the reasons we've discussed, and talking about the need to have a bit of reflection about what works, means that perhaps Starmer is a bit more focused on what he wants from a Cabinet Secretary. And I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about is, this reset, certainly in terms of Morgan McSweeney, there's an emphasis on more political direction. something that he's renowned on, something that people have commented on, is the less government experience that Sue Gray was brought in to give. Others in the team certainly do have that, but they may still notice the lack of somebody who really understands the Whitehall machine, how it can work as a system, and so start to think about how that cabinet secretary can really fill a gap that they know that they need. So I hope that makes a difference. It makes for a better cabinet secretary replacement process.
And just to amplify Kath's point really quickly, I think this does come at quite a good moment in a way, in that Starmer should make it very clear that he wants applicants for this enormous and important job to come with their prescription of how they would sort out some of these problems. And to Sam's point, a lot of them, if not all of them, will be aware of that and will want to sort them out. And it almost gives a bit of a chance through this process to test out the ideas of the leaders in the civil service. I mean, Kath may be smiling because some previous competitions have almost been a bit of a beauty parade of people's diagnoses of problems and solutions at the centre. And I think that that can really usefully be part of that process and give Starmer a bit of ownership about how he wants to run. I completely agree with what the others have said, that it should be for the cabinet secretary to own that. And the moment that we're at, that means that a new cabinet secretary will be able to do it with the support, but not the sort of constant oversight of the political team. But in the end, how Starmer wants to run his centre should be for Starmer. And the qualities he should be looking for in a cabinet secretary, he needs to make clear. And I would say to pick up on Kath's point, leadership and restoring the confidence of the civil service is the absolute kind of first and uppermost of those, and that will require a bit of space from the political team to allow the cabinet secretary to establish themselves and to fill the leadership space in the civil service. Obviously, also then the kind of pointy end of the policy advice, and for the really, really difficult policy issues, cracking heads together across government departments to get that done. But also, and to continue the back scratching, the point that Kath has made is being a public figure in a way that previous cabinet secretaries have not been. So part of the criteria for this job should be that you're not out there all the time. Obviously, you don't have your own messages and policy ideas that you're presenting, but you are confident and comfortable leading 500,000 people in public and being able to talk to those things and being a figure of public interest.
And as you say, perhaps one of the upsides of this change in the situation might be that the political team can focus on the politics and the administrative civil service team can focus on getting the civil service in the right shape, and rather than sort of a bit of a blurred line in the centre before. Go on, Kath.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, though, it does, though, affect, we've been, talking about the need to reflect on the centre, and it's not just suddenly fixed because of these 5 new appointments and the departures. It's going to take time. And, we were looking at the new year for Simon Case's replacement. Alex has talked about, whether or not they can expedite that process, but it is still going to take time. And that means that the centre is not going to be settled, let alone if they do want to look more fundamentally at it and how it can operate. And it kind of goes to the point that how much time has the government got to try and fix these problems? Because stories are ramping up. That supposed honeymoon period, or the leeway you might be given that these are early days and you can still turn it around. The narratives start to set in, and we've certainly seen in recent governments in recent years that it can be hard to turn that narrative around. Obviously, this is a government with a huge majority. They've got till the next election to work on this, and they don't want to be as pulled around by the sort of newspapers or public opinion polling. They want to sort of get down and work on things, but nonetheless, I think there is going to be pressure on them to fix some of these problems that we've seen in the early months as rapidly as possible. And if the problems are more systemic than that, that's going to be difficult to do.
Yeah. Sorry to be up on it, Tim. Just really, I know I would say that, but just to be clear, what I meant, and I think you meant, was not that there should be a sort of separation between the political and the administrative side. I think it would be a real mistake to say, cabinet secretary and civil servants, you go away and focus on government delivery and administration, and we'll do the politics. Part of the point of McSweeney as a new chief of staff and the new team is to synthesize the politics and government in that way. So absolutely, the cabinet secretary should be leading a programme of administrative reform to the centre, but that has to be completely fused together.
Completely. I want to let Sam get a word in anyway. So, Sam, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the new cab sec should be focusing on, or indeed sort of how they can work well with the political team.
So, I mean, I think they need to make sure they're not doing a number 10 fixer job. And that's always the danger of that role, is you get sucked into essentially being a glorified private assistant for the Prime Minister and sorting out all their day-to-day worries. They need to be given the space to think about civil service reform and think about reorganisation of the centre of government. In order to do that, it may be that the new PPS can manage the Prime Minister's sort of needs for fixing purposes, but they may need another person who can do that as well. It's really important to protect the cabinet secretary from ending up doing that, because it's so easy for that to happen. And then I think they need to be given they basically need to be given the space to come up with a proper reform program. And I think we just haven't seen anyone have the opportunity to do that for a very long time. I mean, Gus O'Donnell was probably the last one who really had the chance to do that. Jeremy Hayward was sort of there for a couple of years, got very ill, and was trying to handle the job while sick. Then you had Mark Sedwell, who didn't last very long and had come from a national security background and was pushed out by Boris Johnson. Then you've had Simon Case, who's really struggled from the start and has also been very sick the last year or so. So no one's really had the chance to kind of put their stamp on a reform program for a long time now. So it's a really good opportunity if they're given the space to do that. And civil service morale is so low and so much faith has been lost in the centre that someone who could restore that could give a huge boost to government. So, if they get the right person and give them the space to do the job properly, it's potentially a big opportunity, but it's one that we've seen missed the last few times.
Absolutely. Excuse me. I want to come to some of the audience questions, and I'm going to sort of turn back to the specific reason why we're talking about this now. There's a few questions about Sue Gray and the kind of the role of the Chief of Staff and how it all happened, and then we'll go to some of the bigger questions. But so one person, and again anonymous, says, as a long-time Labour member, I'm aware that misogyny is a constant undercurrent in the party. Is there an element of this in the Sue Gray situation, and how can we ensure women get a proper hearing under the new regime? That's one question. Another question, which I think is quite interesting and maybe some fun criminology, is there a political advantage to announcing these types of things on a Sunday? What do you think would have been in the minds of political strategists? And then Gillian asks, does Sue Gray's exit mean that those briefing against her have won? And if so, what does that mean for how things will function in the future? So misogyny, Sunday announcements, victory in the system.
Shall I do the first and the last, and somebody else can talk about Sunday announcements? Because, disturbed my Sunday. It was actually my mother who noticed before me and WhatsApped me, so well done, Mum. She's probably watching. In terms of misogyny, that has come up quite a bit. And I mean, one can analyse Sue Gray's recent experience in government and the way in which she's been treated in the media and the briefings and so forth, and come to a view about that. I'm not going to go into that. I think there is a risk in some of the narrative around that of actually missing a lot of other women who are quite important in government at the moment. The two deputy chiefs of staff are, women who have been vital to how the government worked in opposition, the development of their position. Jill Cuthbertson, as Alex was saying, has a long history of a very influential role at the heart of government. And we can see, looking back at, even the Blair years, a lot of women who didn't get put into the history book. So I think there is a real risk of actually missing that. So I don't think it is as easy to view it as some of the reporting or comments and so forth have put it, as being Sue Gray versus the boys. That is completely, unfair to the many people who work around Keir Starmer at the moment and have done for some time. But then I think the second thing is just to, think about what it is that, has happened in the immediate aftermath in terms of that briefing, and goes to the point about the narrative and the victory and so forth. Who writes the history in the victory books? It would be a huge mistake for all concerned to turn this into a continuing war of words. And as I say, we did see yesterday a lot of dumping on Sue Gray. We have seen today a lot of pushback by allies of Sue Gray. I think if this continues to be a sort of narrative of both sides wanting to come out on top, it doesn't help anyone. It certainly doesn't help the government, and it won't help any of those people in their current positions, whether it is Morgan McSweeney and those that have remained in No.10, or whether it is Sue Gray in the role that she has moved into. So the sort of ongoing war of words just basically continues the problem that they had. So I would hope that at some point they're able to just move on from that and focus on what they can now do in their roles, rather than continue some kind of vendetta against each other. I think that's the huge risk. And again, it goes back to the point about Keir Starmer and the leadership that he needs to show. Sue Gray is still in government in a very important role. One of the things that she has been praised for is the way in which she came in opposition and built up those relationships with the mayors, built up relationships with members of the shadow cabinet that perhaps felt marginalised. She has an ongoing valuable role that she can play. But if Starmer allows some kind of ongoing vendetta to happen from whichever quarter it is coming, that's going to undermine all of that and just make the problems more endemic. So they need to watch out for that.
Absolutely. Alex, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I agree with everything Kath said about misogyny and vendettas and all of that. Completely right. On the misogyny point, I'd only say I'd commend a commentary from Anushka Asthana, who did a really interesting thread, I think it was earlier today, on this subject, where she both pointed out that there were a lot of very accomplished, very powerful and effective women, not just who'd come in as part of these moves. I mean, the new PPS is one as well, but already in the centre of government. But also, she noted that quite often these people are deputies rather than the top dogs. So there's wouldn't pretend that doesn't still exist. So things to reflect on there. But the point I would alight on is that in the centre of government, in No.10, it's a court, as we always say. It's an intense environment. It's an environment that doesn't always bring out the best in people. It can, when people are under pressure, they can feel like they're in the bunker and that everyone else is against them. And that is the more that anyone of whichever gender can do to break down and to kind of open up that culture of us and them and intense pressure, the less likely you are to get people not performing in ways that we saw during the COVID inquiry were entirely unacceptable in the way that people were talking about others. And I think that speaks to the vendetta and the briefing wars as well, which just need to. I mean, Starmer having done this, maybe one side has won or not, but that means that one side has won, so crack on. You've won, so get on with the job. On the Sunday thing, I mean, who am I to do political handling? The main thing it made me think of was, so they've waited till after the conference season. I think my reflection on the timing was less the Sunday, and I'm sure somehow in media world that does help get a story out in a particular way or bury it in a particular way. But they'd waited till after the conferences. They'd waited till the day before kind of the start of the new term, and clearly the objective there was to immediately say, all right, now we're getting on with the job. It's day one of the new team. Parliament returns, and the question there is, can they capitalise on that? Have they got a refreshed grid that has got, if not loads of just sort of superficial announceables, but a sense of momentum, and to show that something is different now from what went before.
Brilliant. Sam, want to come in on any of those?
Just quickly, I don't think Sunday was intentional. I think they made the decision on Friday and then just needed to make the announcement as quickly as possible because otherwise it would leak at some point. So I think it was just whenever they could get their ducks lined up in a row, they were going to announce it after the initial conversations had been had on Friday. It doesn't really make any difference when you announce stuff anymore because everyone's all online. It's not like the old days when you could bury stuff easily on a Friday night because everyone's still on their phones. On the misogyny point, I mean, I think it's a much broader issue, right, which has been around for many governments in a long time, that there's a sort of culture of depiction of women and of briefing that is very aggressive, typically masculine, can put a lot of people off, and is pretty vicious and unpleasant a lot of the time. I think it was probably at its worst in number 10 during COVID. And a number of people who were involved in the COVID inquiry have actually talked about and reflected on that issue, and sort of women being sort of shouted down and left out of meetings and all of that kind of thing. You saw some evidence of it, I think, actually before the election on the Labour side, with some really vicious briefing against Yvette Cooper and Angela Rayner, particularly. That does seem to have been actually a bit better in government. I mean, there's obviously been plenty of briefing against Sue Gray, but it hasn't been quite that vicious, or as gendered. So I don't know if there's been a sort of understanding of trying not to give that impression from some of the people who were giving those quotes beforehand. But yeah, I mean, it's a long-term issue. I don't think it's as the others have said, I don't think it's a sort of boys versus Sue kind of thing, but there is a sort of much broader issue across Westminster. Certainly.
Great, thank you very much. I want to ask some more of the structural questions now that have come in from the audience. So Julio Romo has asked, since Labour arrived in government, since Starmer arrived in number 10, there's been an apparent lack of vision, direction and narrative from the centre. How do you take control of these issues and resolve them? And how do you get departments and ALBs to work strategically to mission boards? That is possibly the most IFG question ever. Except for this one, David Woodhead says, would it be helpful to resurrect something like Ted Heath's Central Policy Review staff? So for historians of the centre and government, what do people think? How can you get the vision and the direction from the centre? How can you make the missions work? And can current governments learn from previous ones? Kath?
Well, I was going to say I could be boring and do CPRS in a minute if others want to come in first. But I'm on now. CPRS ended up getting killed off by Margaret Thatcher because it was so pie in the sky. And she absolutely hated aspects of it. But to be honest, it's not even the first, because you have to go back to David Lloyd George, but it is one of the incarnations of the sort of modern units that we see in number 10. And we have in our work talked about these kinds of functions being very necessary. One thing we've not talked about today, a unit that's, rightly or wrongly felt a bit more marginalised in the first few months of this government, was the policy unit, which sometimes is quite dominant, sometimes is not. But again, goes all the way back really to Lloyd George and that kind of need for support around a prime minister. Alex has already mentioned, the need for extra economic support at the centre. There's also a bit of a gap around foreign policy as well. But CPRS also speaks to the kind of strategic long-term thinking that prime ministers also need. So all of these things are basically very similar functions that prime ministers have reached for, and they've called them different kinds of names. What is more important is how they dock in, how they're set up, who's in charge of them, and whether or not there's too much overlap between those kind of units in number 10 and the kind of stuff that the Cabinet Office is doing as well. One of the things that we have often said is that prime ministers should learn from their predecessors and not constantly reinvent the wheel in terms of the kind of functions that we know are useful to a prime minister. But I'll let Alex talk in much greater depth about some of those functions and the other strategic, the structural questions that were asked. Too nerdy for me.
Well, I don't know. Nothing's too nerdy, Kath. Well, I'll mostly defer to Sam, I think, on the vision thing, because I want to know what he says. It was an American president, I forget which one, who talked about the vision thing as if it could just be, be done as a thing. And I think that's part of the problem, as far as it goes for me, for what it's worth, is that this is not an ambitious government. Just look at what they're trying say they want to do on planning, or some of the other kind of welfare reforms or reforms to work. This is one case where it may be, so it's cautiously, a case of communicating and presenting what they're trying to do in a way that somehow resonates more than the language of missions does. Because as we always say, I think missions are quite good, but they're and they work. But fundamentally, for me, this may reflect the way I look at it, a way of breaking down barriers in government and organising government and coordinating things. I don't quite see how they work as communications and a political tool, but that's not my bag so much. Which takes me to the mission boards question, and I think there has been some commentary. I'm sort of reserving judgment for the moment, but there's been some commentary that these boards have not met as much as they might, and not getting the purchase on the system that they'll need if missions are to really be a kind of a way of driving and executing government policy. I think the proof of that will be in the budget, and the proof of it will be in the spending review and all the other decisions that are taken. I think let's see, but they will need clearer accountability arrangements. I'm not sure it's the right model to have lead secretaries of state chairing the boards rather than a Pat McFadden, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster figure, and the Prime Minister from the centre pushing these through. So, how is Wes Streeting holding himself accountable for the delivery of the health mission is the exam question for me. And I don't yet see how budgets are going to attach themselves to the mission boards and the missions. And that's easy to say and really, really hard to do. I don't want to underestimate just how difficult it is to attach budgets to missions that cut across all Whitehall cultures and Secretary of State, Departmental Accounting Officer lines. But if you're really serious about it, now is the time to try and get these right.
Go on, Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, on the vision thing, I mean, I think there is a big issue with the lack of clear policy direction on public service reform. I think Alex is absolutely right. In some areas, there is a clear policy direction and very ambitious one. How it's going to be done isn't always clear, but there's a clear direction. When it comes to education, health, policing, the big public services, that isn't there yet. For two reasons. One, they came in pretty undercooked on some of those policy areas. They just didn't do the preparation in opposition for various reasons. Secondly, they didn't have any spending plans when they arrived. There's nothing to base anything on, and they have to do a spending review before they can really start to develop those plans properly, because they have to know what resources they have available, and that's more the fault of the last government, who just didn't leave them any spending plans in place. I think the worst thing they could do is panic and start randomly announcing stuff without thinking it through. They've got policy processes in place in most of these areas, and they need to see them through and let them finish. So they've got a coherent plan, and to start. I keep hearing people saying they need to fill the grid, and I start shivering with fear at this. The last thing they need to do is start making incoherent announcements all over the place that mess up their policy process. But no doubt that is a problem for them, that they can't, that it's going to take time for them to get those policies into place. And I think this is part of the problem with the missions thing, which is for several of those missions, they're related to public services where they don't really have a clear idea of what they want to do yet. So your opportunity mission, what is it? What is it that they're trying to do? What are they trying to do on the health mission? It's not clear. There's no definition. That you can't drive anything when there's no definition. I think they're also very underpowered. I think you need a big public figure who's running those boards. If you want them to be taken seriously, that public figure has to have the Prime Minister's very clear, loud support. He has to be involved in sort of directing them to some degree, and the Treasury need to be told to integrate it into the spending review, the longer term spending review, which will completed in April 25, for them to work. And I don't get the impression that that's happening at the moment. So it feels like it could fizzle unless the new Downing Street regime put a lot more heft behind it and figure out exactly what they want the public service directed ones to do.
Absolutely. For those interested, we had an event on missions at the Labour Party conference, which you can listen back to. Alex was on the panel. I went along. I thought it was a really interesting discussion, and I think it is clearly still being worked out exactly how these are going to work and what they really mean. Time for a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up with last questions from me to the panel. But there's an interesting one, quite popular, from someone anonymous, asking: is it a problem that the new principal private secretary in No.10 has no experience of working in a line department? And they say this is for the first time in 100 years. I have no idea if that's correct or not. Alex, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It's a good IFG start. I feel slightly ashamed that we haven't come up with that one. If that's right. I mean, I alluded a bit to it earlier, which is there is a classic route for the PPS, which is from the Treasury, sometimes from the Home Office or the Foreign Office in recent years. But one of the slightly, sort of bodge job ways that No.10 has dealt with the economic mismatch between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is to have a high-powered and talented high flyer come in from the Treasury to PPS to be a sort of broker between both camps. So I think the way the questioner framed it as a line department, I'm not sure that is, sort of, depends if you include the Treasury as a line department or not, and I'm not sure I would. And I think the thing that will matter is more the skills, attributes, the trust, confidence of the PPS and the Prime Minister and the PPS, and in the PPS herself. So I suppose I'm wary of drawing too many kind of sweeping things around it, and I'm more interested in the kind of total makeup of the skills in number 10 rather than any one individual. I do think, understanding the culture and the weirdness of number 10 is probably part of it, the court atmosphere. So not trying to apply sort of classic management textbook techniques to an environment that is not conducive to them, but finding your way to be very kind of human and sort of shaping the culture of the building, as well as doing all the kind of high-end policy work is critical. But we'll see. You know, I think it'd be wrong to write off anybody 2 days into a job.
Absolutely. This is less a question, more a comment, but I think it's interesting. So I want to share. Roger Daw says he was private secretary to Harold Wilson in number 10 between 1966 and 1970. When I started, there were 5 private secretaries, a small press office, a small political office, no special advisors, and no chief of staff. How times change. So, you know, it wasn't always this complicated. I have a couple more questions for you, but just to one more for fun. From the audience. George Charles asks, do the panel expect Morgan McSweeney to be in number 10 until the next election? Kath.
I hate prediction questions. I think, yes, I do. Whether he is chief of staff through that whole period, I think is an open question. I would hope if he realises he's not the right person for it. And it's worth remembering he has, I think, as I understand it, basically done chief of staff role to Starmer in opposition, again, during a hiatus. So if they decided that there was a better chief of staff out there and McSweeney was better doing something else, I hope they would similarly make that change, as long as it's not sort of constant turmoil. But my understanding of his relationship with Starmer, the project he's worked on, and the way in which they're focusing on the next election kind of suggests that you would expect McSweeney to be around for the duration.
And I was going to say yes as well, but only, and to agree with Kath, in that even if it goes completely successfully, you would still expect him to move into a more campaign-focused role, given what his skills and what he's achieved in the past. So you could see a sort of shift a year out or 18 months out from the next election, regardless, I would have thought.
Sam, you want to make a prediction?
We are far too far away from the next election to make predictions. I mean, you imagine being asked 2 months into the Boris Johnson government what Dominic Cummings will be doing 5 years hence. I think
I could have guessed.
probably nothing good. But yeah, there's so much can change between now and then. But yeah, I mean, they've been close for a very long time, so you wouldn't expect him to disappear very quickly. That's for sure.
Well, okay, so one final question from me for all of you as well. So, we're coming up to the 100 days marker. Obviously, the IFG is not a fan of the whole sort of 100 days thing. We think it's a little bit artificial and creates false incentives to move quickly and break things. But we also think it's often quite common for there to be a reset. How long do you think the government has for this reset to kind of be seen to be working? How can they show that it's working? And are they going to be ready for the budget in 3 weeks' time with the new setup? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. I mean, I think the budget is the moment, right? That's the moment that's going to be. There's 2 moments that are going to be defining. One is the budget, and one is the next bit of the spending review next year, which I think will come alongside quite a lot of public service reform policy, which will emerge from the spending review process. So it's going to be 3 weeks' time, and then early next year are there 2 moments where they can really start to say, here's a plan, here's what we're doing, here are the priorities for this government. And if they fluff both of those, they're going to be in real trouble. If they get certainly the second one really right, then all of this will be forgotten. So It's all about the money, I think, and it's all about how they use that spending review process to make clear what their prioritization is for both for the public and the media, but also internally, so that officials understand what their focus needs to be too.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think to sort of shamelessly steal a point that Sam made earlier, I think one of the tests of success will be whether they can kind of just hold fast to the plan and not feel, get some momentum going, but not just fill the grid with random announcements and panic and start throwing things out in an uncoordinated way. I also think there's a test as to whether they can, and the budget will be absolutely, agree with everything Sam said, the budget will be absolutely critical on this, but I think there's a test about whether they have the confidence to start taking on and winning some arguments. Now, they've done that in various ways. There's the VAT on private schools. They will inevitably come into it on the planning stuff, winter fuel allowance, get into. But there feels a slight sort of tentativeness. And I don't know if that tentativeness is just because the budget hasn't come out yet, and so everybody's holding back, or whether it speaks to a political caution that I don't think they have the time or the space to indulge in. So are they? Do they know their political dividing lines? Do they know the enemies they will inevitably make, and are they confident enough to take those on? And I think that speaks to whether this team will be successful or not. I wouldn't, I mean, famous last words, but I wouldn't expect another major reset moment like this. I think that sort of Starmer has had this shot and it needs to work, or he's on a path dependency to it not working. And I think if you saw, obviously personnel will change, but that's likely to be more incremental rather than as a big reset moment. But as well as all the points Sam said, I think there's a question of kind of almost sort of the courage to govern, which will become clear over the course of the next 6 months.
Bill, thank you. Last word to you, Kath. What do you think?
Yeah, agree with a lot of that. I think the budget has obviously, whether it was intentional or not, that is the narrative that this government has created for itself, that the budget is the key moment, both in terms of the timing. They wanted to take their time before getting to the budget, and also the sort of story arc whereby a lot of things have been driven off the back of the difficult state that the public finances are in and that departments are in. So everyone is looking to the budget and already seeing the ways in which they are sort of pitch rolling for that. So that is inevitable. But I do similarly hope that, with this reset, you saw in the aftermath quite a bit of, Tim was appalled when they were talking about having a reshuffle, a ministerial reshuffle to follow this particular reset. That seems to have now been damped down. It feels like Starmer and his team have tried to put a lid on the idea of constant resets and don't want to be that. So I would hope that they would take the lessons from their first 100 days and now focus on their second 100 days and want to be in a very different position by the end of that.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much. So that is time, I'm afraid. So thank you to Kath, Alex and Sam for joining us. Thank you for everyone watching. Apologies to those whose questions we couldn't get to. The audio of this webinar will be on our podcast feed tomorrow, and you'll be able to watch the video back on our website shortly after it finishes. If you go to our website, you can also see all of the work that we've talked about that Alex and team have written on the centre of government. Even though the Sue Gray era is over and the Morgan McSweeney era has begun, I am sure we will keep talking about how all of this stuff works. Keep following the IFG for more on everything to do with the centre of government. Thank you very much.